Ari Louis Show.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Ari Louis Show on Israel Sports and News Radio. Thank you for joining us. At any time, you can email the program arilouisshow@hotmail.com, or you can email the station Israel Sports and News Radio at gmail.com. In the last several months in Israel, hot topic regarding torture. Is it moral? Is it not? Should it be used? Should it not? And does it apply itself equally to Jews and non-Jews? Interesting enough, torture topic was not known among most Israelis up until recently. So I decided to contact stoptorture.org, find out more about it. On the line right now is the CEO of that organization, giving us time out of her busy schedule to come on the program, Dr. Rachel Strouma. Doctor, welcome to the program.
Hi, Ari. Thank you, and thanks for having me on.
I want to know the particular laws regarding Israel, what the Shin Bet is allowed to do, what they actually do if they break the law, and how many incidents occur every year with this regard.
Right. Okay. So just to set the record straight, no one in Israel is allowed to torture. Torture is completely illegal. The only debate at the moment is whether certain practices constitute torture or whether they fall under special means or special practices. So our argument really with the state is whether those special practices amount to torture. We've seen that implemented in the case of the youth arrested for the murderous incident in Douma. We've seen that much more frequently with Palestinian detainees. But you will not find a Ministry of Justice official who will say to you, yes, the Shin Bet, the Shabak is allowed to torture in these cases.
Okay. However, even though that would be illegal, how many accusations occur every year against Shin Bet or any other government group in Israel?
I can tell you that the number of cases we treat every year is over 100. Now, obviously, these are not all the complaints that reach our offices. We only proceed with a certain percentage of those complaints. And, of course, the people who reach our offices are only a small percentage of the people who encounter these practices. So we're talking really about a system here. We're talking about a policy.
Okay, so let's talk. I want to know in the grand scheme of things, obviously if it happens once, it's a violation of law, that's one too many. But the number 100 or dozens of times, give my audience perspective of what that means. I mean, Israel has approximately 8 million people in it. Some people might say, well, that's not a lot of people when you factor the whole size of the country. Explain what that number means exactly.
You mean in terms of the percentage of the population?
Well, for example, there's a complaint in the United States, Guantanamo Bay, and people will say, but that's not the entire government, it's a small percentage or whatever. I want to know, as far as general Western countries, is Israel more prone to potential illegal activities amongst government or less prone? I want you to compare it to other countries and give us its relation to the population.
I see. Okay. Israel is actually unique here among the Western democratic countries. When we speak to our colleagues in Europe or in North America, the one thing they point out is that Israel is the one place in the world where there's actually a debate over whether or not torture is legal. And this is really unheard of in the international community. So it's not just the fact that people do encounter torture in the Shin Bet also, but the fact that the legal system is not willing to condone these incidents. The fact that the people who are responsible for this enjoy complete impunity. In the last decade, we've presented more than 900 complaints regarding torture, and not a single one of those complaints has led to a criminal investigation. Now, this is really a case where 100% impunity. So this is where Israel really stands out, and not in a good way, from the rest of the crowd.
All right, so that's kind of a scary thing. Why is that? How come all these investigations no investigations despite all the complaints? Why is that?
The Israeli legal system is unusual in that the Shabak is the exception in every single instance. So, for instance, the Shabak interrogations are not filmed. There's no audiovisual documentation. And if we compare this, even in Guantanamo, the interrogations were filmed. They don't happen and then disappear into the void. And in Israel, police interrogations are filmed, but the Shabak is exempted from that law. And this is just one instance, but the same occurs across the board. The Shabak is exempted from the Freedom of Information Act. The Shabak is exempted from all the internal review boards. And this is just one other instance of the Shabak being the exception. So when we look at police interrogations, if we have a complaint, we can, sometimes we say the investigations are not prompt enough. Sometimes we think a criminal investigation should have been opened, and it wasn't. But we're looking at more or less a functioning system. When we look at the Shabak, when we look at the security agency, there is not a functioning system.
All right, and the argument in their favor, I guess, if that makes sense, is that, well, they would say they have to monitor terrorism. They're dealing with such serious things. They can't afford to have their investigations filmed, those type of things. Is that their argument, the Shin Bet's argument?
That's not even the argument. The argument so far, when we've brought this before the High Court of Justice, has simply been the Shabak operates on a different plane. There ought to be no problem with audiovisual documentation, and then in case of a complaint, it can be shown before a judge in closed chambers, for instance. I mean, there are many, many ways in which we can protect the security interests without harming the rights of the detainees. But we haven't reached that point yet.
Will we reach it at some point? Because I can kind of feel my audience being more terrified. Again, I don't think people knew about this kind of stuff for the Hilltop Youth. So will we get to that point anytime soon where things will be monitored?
I'm really, really hopeful that now that things have become much more open, now that people are starting to hear these stories in the mainstream press, that we're starting to talk about what these practices actually mean. We're starting to understand that when somebody complains about an interrogation, he's also complaining about practices of sexual harassment. We've heard of many, many cases of people not being allowed to pray or being given food that the dietary laws don't allow them to eat. We hear stories of people being tied in stress positions and stories of neurological damage. I think the Israeli public, once it sees these stories, is willing to say, we need to take another look at this. As long as everything happened in closed quarters, in chambers where no one else could see it, then people could carry on ignoring it. Now that the story is out in the open, I can see that the public is much more willing to start talking about maybe we should have a doctrine of fruit of the poison tree, which, by the way, does not exist in Israel. In Israel, a confession obtained under torture is not invalid.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
The whole doctrine of fruit of the poison tree, which is, so obvious to people coming from North America, is just not present in the Israeli system. So there are various. You're supposed to give a confession out of your free will and by free will and consent, but if you don't, it doesn't invalidate the entire investigation following it. It doesn't invalidate the confession. So people are now talking about it, and I think this is really where the ray of hope comes in. And I will just add that changes can happen overnight. We know that in 1999, following a High Court of Justice hearing, the Shabak used to torture not dozens of cases of people a year, but hundreds of people a year. And from one day to the next, following a High Court of Justice hearing, there was a massive drop in the number of incidents. So all we have to do is repeat that and move from dozens of incidents to none.
That would be good. Again, this is the Ari Louis Show on Israel Sports News Radio. Kind of learning myself, actually, going on some of this very new information to me about the Shin Bet, their policies not being monitored, etc. Okay, I want to go to the aspect that a confession obtained through torture is still valid. Let's go with the Hilltop Youth situation. Apparently reports are that one of the detainees confessed. What happens if he didn't do it? What goes from there? At some point, let's say they find out 5-10 years from now, this young man didn't do it, but he was forced to say he did it because he was being tortured. He thought he was going to die, so he just figured I might as well confess. What happens? Can he sue? Not that it maybe would help him that much. He still has all this damage. But what happens after the fact that they find out the confession was no good?
That's an interesting thought experiment. I can tell you. I can tell you that in the past these attempts have not been successful. I think certainly somebody who can prove that a confession was obtained under duress and was false, he can certainly sue for damages. He can certainly sue for under the civil law. What happens under procedural law is a very good question.
And I also want to go over the fact you were talking about torture is illegal. The question is what constitutes torture or not. So if the Shin Bet tied these young men in ways, I kind of don't even want to describe it, but people seeing the images, they hunt them upside down, if they sleep deprive them, if they deprive them of food, these type of things, does that constitute a violation of the law and it constitutes torture?
The High Court of Justice is very clear on this, that the necessity defense, the so-called ticking bomb defense, cannot apply to torture. Okay? Now, the question is, how do you define torture? And there's no definition under Israeli law, so we look at international law. International law is very, very clear on how to categorize torture. If these youth experience severe pain and suffering, then that's torture. Now, I would challenge your listeners to try and tie themselves up to a chair for several hours and see if they experience pain and suffering.
Well, even more so. I know personally if I go maybe an extra 4 or 5 hours without the sleep I want, I'm already really off. I'm a bit of a baby with that, but I couldn't imagine going 2-3 days without sleep and then being asked questions and being dizzy and confused, and who knows what happens from there. You just kind of want it to end. I can't believe Israel does not have a definition for torture. How is that possible?
Israel has not criminalized torture per se. Okay? If somebody, say, let's take another scenario. If a policeman arrests you, holds you in a cell, and tortures you beats you up for 2 days, you cannot sue him for torture. There's no such criminal offense. You can sue him for dereliction of his duty or other types of offenses, but not for torture. The Public Committee Against Torture, PICATI, has been working very hard to push for the criminalization of torture. But I think we have to remember that it's not enough to have a law on the books. The real question is how that law is implemented.
Well said. Again, this is the Ari Louis Show on Israel Sports News Radio, talking about torture in Israel. And I want to know, as far as the Shin Bet, they have this type of power where they can arrest someone just because they can investigate them and it's not monitored. And I'm being totally serious about this. Personally, is anyone in your organization ever scared that the Shin Bet might just come in, take someone from your organization, say, we think you're a traitor to Israel, we're going to investigate you, or we're going to interrogate you, etc.? Is that ever a fear from anyone in your organization?
No, not. I don't want to speak for other people. I don't think that's what bothers people. I don't think people lie awake at night with these thoughts. I think the Shin Bet interrogators see themselves as doing their duty and following the law. And I think the fact that no one has been prosecuted, that not a single criminal investigation has been opened, shows that in general the Ministry of Justice agrees that they're doing their job. What we are contending, and I think what the Israeli public is saying, is that there's something wrong with the norms here, and we simply have to change them. But don't think that our staff members feel targeted by the Shin Bet.
Okay, so that's something that's good to know. I mean, obviously, we're hearing things we're not so happy about, but you don't think it's an out-of-whack, chaotic scenario where they have the type of power that people should be afraid of. It's that what they're doing to try to achieve their goal, that should be changed. Is that what you're saying?
I think people should be very afraid of the loss of democracy here. I think when an organization operates completely in the dark, when there's absolutely no oversight, we should all be very worried, but not just because we're worried for ourselves. We should be worried because of the future of the state. We should be worried because this is not how a democracy operates.
All right, and what's also interesting in the last few months, obviously because the Hilltop Youth are Jewish, that kind of, I think, hit a chord more with the Jewish population, but before the Hilltop Youth, were most of the cases against torture claims were brought by Arab citizens, etc. Was that more the case? More that it happened more among them than among Jewish people?
Yes, absolutely. Not so much Palestinian citizens of Israel, although we had some cases like that, but much more frequently it's Palestinians living beyond the Green Line in the Palestinian Authority. And I think there's also a certain degree of, I don't want to say anger, but perhaps annoyance at the fact that people are only waking up now, because this is something that has been going on for years.
Absolutely. Look, and I'll admit it. I didn't know too much about it. I knew somewhat about it, but obviously it was more shown because of what happened with the Hilltop Youth. Going to the Hilltop Youth, I want to talk about them a bit because they've been very open about what they want to do. They say they want to destroy the state of Israel through different types of ways, pinpoint scenarios they call it. Let's say again the Shin Bet's argument is we've got to do something to stop them. You got to let us do our jobs. Your response would be you could do it, but you should not do it through torture. And I just want to clarify: is that what you would be saying?
I think we all believe in the rule of law. And I think this is where things go beyond the rule of law. Just as when there's a case of a very serious criminal, we say to the police, we as the citizens of the state say to the police, please do go ahead, investigate, interrogate, but keep within certain parameters. I think the same goes for the Shin Bet. We've heard cases of people in organized crime who are certainly pose no less of a risk to citizens on the street. And we don't expect the police to use torture in their interrogations.
Very interesting. Well said. Again, this is the Ari Louis Show on Israel Sports News Radio. A few more minutes, we're discussing the torture issue in Israel. You were talking about that things can change overnight. Your organization obviously wants to change things. People listening, they want to help, get involved. What can they do?
I think the first thing is to go onto our website and educate themselves, to learn the facts, to know what's happening in your state, what's going on. We've been a bit astonished to find out how astonished people are. So I think that's the first thing. And, of course, everyone's welcome to also see our updates on our Facebook page.
All right. And, it's interesting because even though we've heard some shocking things, I get the vibe that you're optimistic that things really can change, that can actually happen. You brought, again, the example of the High Court in the late 90s. So I get more of an optimistic vibe from you.
I am an optimist because when you hear these stories day in and day out, you've got to think that this is not going to stay this way forever. I'm also an optimist because I see people's shock. I see the way people react to the story of once a story ends up in the mainstream press, I see the way people react, and I hear very few people who are saying, you know what, it's okay that they were treated this way. We're willing to live in a state that does that. What we're encountering much more often is people going, wait a second, how is this possible? And this is where I think the change will come about.
All right. Fascinating discussion. Really appreciate the time, appreciate the awareness. People want to learn more, figure out what's going on, get involved. Doctor, we appreciate the time. Very important message you're saying on my program. Really appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you on behalf of my audience as well.
Thank you very much, Ari.
All right, be well.
Thank you for the time.
Have a good evening. Take care.